Hi, everyone. I'm Denile Doyle, and welcome back to Management Diaries. This is MHN's property management podcast where we get into the real side of property management, everything from what's working in leasing and maintenance to resident experience, leadership lessons, business strategy, and everything in between. Today, I'm really excited to have Stacy Brown with us. Stacy is Vice President of Property Management Enablement at Real Property Management. That's a mouthful. She's been at Real Property Management since 2012, and she's actually worked in property management for over 30 years, 37 years to be exact. She's worked in single family, multifamily, among other property types. So she definitely has seen a lot in her career. We are actually recording this as we get ready to kick off National Preparedness Month in September. So today we're really going to dive into why preparedness is a must-have in multifamily, why it's not optional, but it's actually a requirement and a necessity. So Stacy, welcome and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Danielle. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
So to kick things off, can you tell us a little bit about your role at Real Property Management?
Sure. So my role is to develop and guide the training that helps property management company franchise owners and their teams across all 50 states run efficiently, transparently, and profitable. That includes preparing them for everyday issues and those unexpected events that come with managing all types of properties.
Right. Okay. So if we're thinking about National Preparedness Month, right, we're not thinking in terms of households or communities. If we're thinking about it in terms of multifamily and multifamily property management, why is preparedness something that owners and operators should care about and should pay attention to?
Well, because being preparedness is basically risk management in action, right? So when you're talking about a multifamily setting, just one thing affects everyone, and I'm talking about things like power outages, floods, heck, a fire alarm in a high rise, right? It can impact dozens of households simultaneously. So if your management company or your manager and or your investment property owner don't plan ahead to protect the residents and reduce what's going to happen, then they're not protecting their bottom line.
Right. Very important point there. You're saying that, protecting the residents and protecting your bottom line, right? Those two go hand in hand.
Absolutely.
So great setup there. Thank you, Stacy. If we are thinking about sort of a real world example, do you have an example that you've seen where a property really benefited from having that, preparedness, or where they struggled actually because it wasn't a priority?
Yeah, so I remember one in Florida where they ran drills all the time with hurricanes, and then out in Nevada they would run earthquake drills. And that kind of got them on board before anything even hit, right? They had backups of key vendors and contractors. And then on the other hand, in Atlanta, Georgia, I've seen a small leak turn into a massive issue where it degraded subfloors and things like that. I've also seen the same thing in Nevada with where they didn't pay attention to the riser rooms, and we had frozen risers that exploded over the Christmas holidays. So you got to make sure you're looking at where the risk is in your particular building and in your particular region.
Yeah, and you touched on some pretty serious risks there, right? I mean, an
Yeah.
exploding riser room or, just things kind of not being thought about and always kind of happening at the worst possible time, right? During the holidays. That's not a good time for something to go
No.
wrong that you could have prepared for. And of course, natural disasters, that's something that you always think about when it comes to preparedness. So there are these, different types of risks and different levels of risks. In your experience, what are the risks that owners and operators should really be prioritizing when they are doing this sort of preparedness planning?
Yeah, I mean, you've got some pretty big ones out there, right? We've got fire, not just fire to the structure, but also wildfire, right? We've got those weather extremes, those hurricanes, those I live in Texas now. The tornadoes are a new thing for me, right? The earthquakes, all those sort of things. But anything that's going to affect the water or the power, right? Those are the big ones that you have to make sure that you have like that risk plan in place and also a communication plan in place, right? To make sure that we're able to get a hold of our contractors, get a hold of our residents, get a hold of our investment property owners. Again, because preparedness is risk management in action.
Right. So you're basically saying start with anything that relates to water and power. Like definitely start there and kind of work your way down, right? That's
Yeah. And then also be thinking about contingencies, right? You can have the best laid plans, but again, in Nevada, we had to have all those backup contractors.
so thinking about something like that. Do you have an example of something that was uncovered kind of during this preparedness planning, during that risk assessment stage, something that was uncovered that actually, ended up being more important?
Yeah, there's been multiple cases of, circuits that run together or equipment that just happen to have a very slow leak. Think about your boilers and chillers in older buildings. And as we're going through doing that risk assessment, all of a sudden we're seeing these issues. And I think that it comes back around to make sure you're evaluating your property with a clean lens. I used to take my brand new leasing agents and have them go with because it was brand new to them. And they would see things that although we may have seen it, it doesn't cognitively hit, right? Because it's just we tend to skim a room rather than pay attention to things. So again, I once found a leak that if we hadn't have fixed it, it would have ended up going down 18 floors. And Lord only knows the damage it would have done behind the walls, right? And it all was from a chiller that had just a very slow leak, but she happened to notice a puddle on the floor, and we were able to take care of it rather quickly. And I think it only ended up costing us maybe $250 for the part.
Wow, something like that definitely would have been astronomical, right? If it had continued and it hadn't been caught.
Hmm. Yeah, because it was going behind the walls. No one would have noticed it until it was at a critical state.
Exactly. And great point about like that fresh set of eyes, right? Like to see kind of things that, that others who've just been looking and have been seeing the space more frequently would not necessarily see, right? And this is how come
Yeah.
you had that associate that saw that noticed that puddle there.
Yeah, we had a thing in our office where everyone was required to look up, right? Because we didn't notice we had earthquake damage in a clubhouse in Nevada. Because no one ever looked up at the ceiling. Until one day somebody did, and we saw this huge crack, right? We had some structural damage.
Wow. Right. So one you had someone look up and you had someone look down, right? But
Yeah.
you really do have to be on the lookout for I guess not where you normally look, right? That's kind of the key
Hmm.
here.
Yep.
But that's very eye-opening. So, obviously the details are very important when you're planning, okay, and doing the risk assessments. But how can
Hmm.
operators assess their level of readiness and assess just where they are without really just getting bogged down with all of the details?
Yeah. So again, I really believe everything starts with people. It really does. You've got to look at the people, what they can do, how they can communicate, and that includes your vendors, right? You've got to look at those big ones, power and water, right? So if you go through and you score all of those things, like heat map them, when you start to see reds, that's the things that you have to take care of right away. You know, we had this is kind of, I'm going to jump ahead on one of your questions, Dylan, if you don't mind. You know, big rare event that happened down in Houston, Texas. One of our franchise offices was in the middle of these massive floods and this hurricane, and power was out everywhere. Well, they have remote team members that they use for leasing and so on. These people jumped in and started coordinating with vendors to take care of the residents and you know take care of the issue. So in that particular office, their people was way green. In fact, it was more green than they even thought. Now they're doing these 5 by 5 checks, right? And they're constantly looking at that on every 6 month basis. But until then, they wouldn't have guessed that their people was a real priority and a real boon in their risk management plan.
Yeah, it sounds like that became really really important and kind of helped them shift, what they were doing and shift their process moving forward.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so if we shift to the training side, okay, when we're thinking about training your people and training teams, how do you know, kind of differentiate that or find that balance between things that are more high impact incidents, um, that really have more significant, whether it's damage or, more significant financial
Mhm.
consequences. How do you differentiate that between the more common day-to-day incidents that, are still disruptive, but just, maybe just lower on the scale of damages or costs?
Sure. So, I mean, let's face it, by and large, management companies end up training people for day in, day out stuff, right? And that might touch on that water and that power and things like that. But I think making a plan to make this preparedness alongside with things such as fair housing training, right? We're doing those generally once a quarter. Why not do kind of drills once a quarter? Danielle, I don't know where you went to school when you were a kid, but when I was a kid, we did earthquake drills, right? You had to hide under your desk when the alarm went off, right? Everybody had fire alarms. Why do we stop doing that when we're responsible for hundreds of people? We should be instilling these things as common culture rather than one-off occurrences. And I think the more you normalize, hey, we have these things happen, but we're prepared, the better informed our residents are, the happy our investment property owners are, and honestly, our staff knows what's going on too. So it's not a panic situation. It's just, oh, well, this happened. Now we go to plan B.
Yeah, no, I don't know what the answer to that question is, right? But it's such a great question. Like, why do we stop doing that? And why do we not have that mindset anymore once we move into like, into apartment living and property management,
Yeah,
right? Why does it become okay to have it less frequently, have these sorts of checks and trainings and drills, right?
you sure?
So okay, as far as training goes, do you think that it's important for these? Okay, so it's things like the frequency, right? That's definitely something that you want to have standardized because you want,
Mhm.
to have these checks and check on things more often so that way you can catch things before they, really get out of control, right? Such as that leak that you gave that example about, right? And if you weren't doing these kinds of checks, something like that could really go unnoticed for a long period of time. So when you're thinking about a training program, how do you decide the things that really you should standardize across a portfolio versus what you should customize?
So I'm assuming you're talking about multiple sites. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so I mean, obviously you're going to have your actual framework, right? That goes across your company, and that's how you communicate everything all the time. But then you get specific things, right? Like I said, I had the high rise with the chillers. I had the low rise that had a pond out there that would tend to flood, right? So those are the one-offs that you have to kind of add in. But I think it's important that you have an overarching framework that everybody goes in between because that makes it easy. I mean, especially when you've got different roles, maybe swapping sites. If you've got a different plan for every single site, that becomes untenable. It becomes you can't make that scale. But if you have the overarching framework, and then I've got my one-offs that are just added on addendums, if you will, now I've got a cohesive plan that anyone can jump in, and if I have to take a manager from site A and throw them over to site C, they've got kind of, well, I hate to say it, but they kind of got like the McDonald's playbook, right? Now they just know what to do.
Right. So it's important to really have that framework, that foundation, right? So that,
Hmm.
yes, if someone else is coming in, they know what to do and they're not like, oh, this doesn't make any sense, for this property compared to like another property, right?
Yeah, we're enabling them to lead the process for us, right?
Yeah, that's great advice. That's great advice, Stacy. Sometimes things don't go according to plan, right? Or sometimes you have to even like deviate from the plan, right? Just depending on the situation. So have you seen a situation where a community had to kind of take the standard plan and really deviate from it to deal with a more unique situation?
Well, sure. I talked about the case down here in Texas with the hurricanes and the freezing rain, right? Um, we also had a community once out in California during actually the pandemic where they decided that they were going to send out electronically to everyone, hey, your neighbors are, elderly, but they can't go get their medications. This neighbor just had a baby and right. So they came up with this. Oh goodness, I can't remember what they called it, but it was kind of like a buddy check thing, right? Where they would reach out to their neighbors, and we had people who had never met, because that's another thing that stopped being normal, right? People stopped getting to know their neighbors. The people that never met that are knocking on the door and handing over a thing of formula for the new mom, or running over with some soup and prescriptions for Mr. Jones, who they haven't seen out of his apartment for months, right? So that was kind of a neat deviation. But like I said, the other one in Texas, the deviation was not so much what management or anyone else put in place. It was, and this is why I come back to people as your number one resource in disaster preparedness. The people jumped up and said, we see a need. It's not hurting us. It's not affecting us personally right now. So we're going to jump in and just take care of the situation. Did that kind of answer the question?
Yes, that did, Stacy. Um, and I am hearing the theme of the people, right? Of your teams and your staff, and they're the ones that are really that are seeing things, and they're the ones that are jumping into action and making things happen. And they're doing that for the residents, right? Who, of course, they're a big part of the puzzle, right? They're the ones
Yeah.
living there.
Well, and these
Um,
people see them every day. So your staff becomes the bright, shiny answer.
yes, yes, exactly. That's what you want. You want them to be that, right?
Yes.
So okay, and thinking about that relationship then between your your staff and residents, what are some strategies that you have found to be effective in kind of communicating emergency plans or procedures with residents without it being so overwhelming for them, or without, giving them any kind of anxiety or making them alarmed about it?
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to what I said earlier about, why did we stop doing fire alarms, right? We just got to keep it simple. FEMA does a great job of those little one pagers of things that happen in your location, right? The wildfire ones for the West Coast are fabulous. The hurricane for the East Coast and Central Coast are wonderful. They're not so great when it comes to the snowbound states, but that sort of thing, like the one pagers, the info type things. And I think what we need to do is start it in the leasing process where it becomes a part of the lease and it's talked about, right? Because if the only time we talk about it is when some impending doom is coming, I'm not really preparing, am I? So it's got to be ingrained into your culture. And then it's got to be ingrained into the whole residential journey as they go through it, right? We want them to be confident. We don't want them to be freaked out when something happens, right? And then when something does happen, make sure you're communicating.
Yeah, no, great point. It does need to be ingrained in the culture. And also the other point, which I think is an important one as well, is that you're not preparing if only when there's something impending, that's when you're kind of like, here's what you should do, right? Because
Yeah.
you've passed the stage of where, where you should have prepared for it because now it's basically, I guess you could equate it to studying for a test like a week or several weeks before the test, or, the night before, you're not really preparing for the test because it's here, it's already here.
Yeah.
And so when you have an event that's imminent, you're thinking, oh, here, we should have something in place, or we should have some procedure to share, but you're not prepared at that point. What about an example of a community where preparedness really paid off and helped them to navigate a situation that came up, navigate an incident because they really did that preparedness ahead of time?
So, Danielle, and not to be redundant here, but I got to take you back to this one because it was such a great example of this. That freeze in Nevada. Um, After that happened, we started staging heaters and checking the systems every single hour, right? So in doing that, as the other communities around us had those riser rooms just, blowing up and the freeze was terrible, we were able to keep our residents safe and happy, and our damage was 70% lower than the neighboring communities that didn't take the same lessons that we did the year before.
70% is a lot, Stacy.
It was a lot.
That is a huge number. Okay. But yeah, that really does illustrate that the importance of doing that, right? So you've had the incident the year before, and you realized, hey, we need to be prepared. And so taking the steps and investing in that. Okay, on the flip side, right? Let's talk about another example of how the lack of preparedness could have a serious operational impact.
So let's think about when HVAC systems go down, right? They never go down Monday through Friday at 3 p.m. It's usually over a holiday or a weekend or in the middle of the night, right? And it's always during a sub-zero day or a 102 plus heat advisory. So in those instances, and that's the first one that comes to mind, that's where a lack would really hurt.
Right. So in a situation like that, Stacy, because that is, we all know that to be true at the height of summer and, during a heat wave, that's exactly when the HVAC systems are going out for everyone, right? All at the
Yeah.
same time. So what could owners or what could operators do differently for, ahead of that situation occurring?
I've been on sites before where people feel that the maintenance techs or the maintenance supervisors are the ones that are going to be running around and taking care of these. But we are on a property that has 1,000 plus units. That's not happening. And maybe not everybody is HVAC certified, right? So now we're talking about contractors. And then what happens if all the contractors are booked, right? We took something that should have been taken care of in days and we turned it into weeks, right? So securing vendor agreements and make sure you've got backups, right? Stocking those mitigation supplies, right? And this one is so elementary, and it goes back to my fire drill thing. Test the call tree, right? When someone calls the maintenance hotline and it's an emergency, is it actually going to the people that it needs to go to? You need to test these things. If we don't test, then we don't know it's working. Are we really prepared?
Right. That can be the slogan for this episode. If we don't test and we don't know what's working, are we really prepared? Um, and that really is important, especially when you have the impact afterward of not being prepared, right?
Sure.
Okay, Stacy, as we wrap up our conversation, I want to ask you to share one action that property managers could take this month that would make the biggest difference if something unexpected or if an emergency hit like tomorrow?
Yeah, I think you already know what I'm going to say, but let's make it a practice and part of our culture that we walk through realistic scenarios, right? We do those fire drills to find the gaps, close the gaps, and make it easy to talk about, right? Talking about disaster, talking about being prepared should be ridiculously easy for everyone to talk about. Otherwise, we really have to learn those hard lessons, right? And that 1 hour every quarter really could save somebody if something really bad happens. It definitely could save days of people, running around like crazy in an actual emergency. So go back to the fire drills, folks. That's the best advice I can give.
You heard it, everyone. Go back to the fire drills, test it, see if it's working, talk about it, really invest the time, in doing those things, right? Because I mean, really, the time that you're investing to do these kinds of checks and this kind of preparedness, it's minimal, right? Compared to when something actually takes place and you're prepared. It's minimal to the time you'd have to invest if you weren't prepared, right, Stacy?
No, exactly.
So before we let you go, Stacy, I want us to close just on a bit more personal note. Can you share a recent moment where someone did something kind that really just stuck with you or made your day?
So it's this one's not recent, but this one has been mine for a very long time. We were doing a regional training. And after it all was said and done, I was walking off with managers to have another meeting. The leasing supervisor was over here with leasing agents. The maintenance techs were, off running off doing their thing. There was a new leasing agent that stuck behind and cleaned up the entire kitchen in the clubhouse. And he left a note, and it just said, "Make it easier for the people who come after you." That one thing has really stuck with me, right? I mean, that was preparedness, that was leadership, and it was all in one simple sentence, one little action. And that young man, by the way, became a regional manager awfully quick because he had that in his DNA, right? So I would say, again, preparedness is equal to risk management and action, is equal to leadership, is equal to what exactly it is that makes us stand apart as professional property managers in this space.
I love that, Stacy. That's such a nice example. Hopefully he's listening.
I hope
But
so.
if he's not, just, you just send him the link to listen. But no, I love that you tied leadership into that preparedness, right? It's not just being prepared for the sake of being prepared, right? It's actually an essential part of leadership. And also outside of property management, just imagine how that would translate just in our day to day, right? Make it a little
Yeah.
easier for whoever's coming after us. So that is great. Everyone, make it a little easier for who's coming after. Okay, Stacy, do really want to thank you again for chatting with me today. And thank you everyone for watching this episode or listening to this episode. And remember to subscribe so you don't miss another episode of Management Diaries. Thank you, Stacy.
Thank you, Danielle. Have a great afternoon.